Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the final lecture of the semester, and it is recorded. The next time I see you will be in the final exam on Friday the 16th. There's a lot of material left over, as is usually the case. The best thing to do, as I've told you many times, is to read the textbook and focus on the things that I emphasize in class. The first announcement that will be made this Friday is the fact that you don't have to worry about most of Chapter 8, okay? But today I'm going to stay away from the textbook and I'm just going to emphasize the points that I think are most important. And on Friday, we will use the textbook as the framework for the lecture, and we'll follow from one event to another and one issue to another, and sort of wrap things up in class. Even though this, I'm speaking to you from the past, and I haven't done that lecture yet. It's kind of complicated, a little bit of professor gymnastics going on here. But anyway, this is week 14, and this will be posted as the last lecture on week 14. Okay, so the quiz is going to happen before this. I'm not going to even bother posting this on the cyber campus just to avoid confusion. All that having been said, we got a lot to say today. I'm not going to try and say all of it, but certainly we need to hit some of the important things that make America the country that is so famous, the country that has spread English and their culture all over the world, and as a consequence, we have decided to study them as a course. America's road to superpower, as I said, ran directly through the industrialization and expansion of American resources and labor. So when America was developing and when they became independent, the Civil War was a step backward in many ways, but progressive in, of course, the constitutional, ethical, and political direction, but an incredible amount of damage to the economy and the society and the number of people who died. A terrible tragedy in American history, but maybe something that was necessary for America to go to the next stage and to grow. We talked about this. It's more difficult to talk about the Civil War that way because just recently there was still people alive who experienced it. You know, it was within living memory when I was young. In the 1980s, there were still people alive who were born in the 1860s. So it's a little bit different talking about the Black Death and saying, well, it killed 30% of the people in Europe and 50% of the people in big cities. But afterwards, you know, peasants got more rights and wages went up, and there was, more fair treatment towards people. The peasants got, serfdom was abolished, and those labor shortages and financial problems and issues that came later were not a problem. The 15th century was sort of the golden age of the yeoman. It's not a middle class really, but it's an independent farmer that existed in England, and that was largely because so many people had disappeared from the Black Death. What are the positive consequences to the American Civil War? I'm not going to go there because we don't have time for that, and that's not my expertise. But there you can find plenty of literature arguing all sorts of things. Like I said, a lot of people make the mistaken assumption that the British Empire started its decline after they lost the American colonies, but in fact, the British Empire accelerated its growth and became at its largest, most powerful, pretty much exactly 100 years later after America separated. But eventually, America was going to overcome them. When did it happen? Well, the best thing to do, what I found, I got this not from my own plan or organization, but I think for you, as well as me, who are not Americans, the best thing to do is just to look at how America went from 19th century isolationist to, as I said, the frontier being closed. So there's no frontier anymore. And the rest of the powerful countries in the world all have colonies, except for some of them, like Germany doesn't really, and Germany wants them too. These countries who are very big and powerful have lots of technology, and they consider themselves civilized and developed, have big populations and good education. They think they deserve what the British Empire has, and the French do, right? And the Spanish still do, even though Spanish Empire's sort of been falling apart for a long time. Germany and to a certain extent the United States want that too. As I said, they get in a war with Spain and they defeat Spain fairly easily, but then they have this sort of ambiguous feeling. They're not ready to be a real empire. They don't want to make the Philippines a permanent part of America, because that really would mean that it was an American empire with the Philippines as a sort of colony. So they don't do that. They occupy it for a long time. But there are some indications that they were grasping, across the ocean at ways of securing their power and spreading it out, right? Which was, eventually Hawaii becomes a state. Guam is a I think it's labeled as a protectorate, or anyway, they have rights as citizens as well. Guam and Saipan. Hawaii has official state status. There's the Marianas. All these places belong to the United States. Puerto Rico, in fact, is not a state, although some people think it should be. Now, all those issues aside, this happens when the 20th century turns. The whole kind of thing starts to shift. It doesn't suddenly go from, no, we're going to be neutral, we're not going to be involved in other things, to we're going to attack the Spanish and we're going to take all their stuff. But there's a group of people, Theodore Roosevelt is one of them. They're really interested in, now that America is starting to grow and develop and become powerful, that they need to have a muscular policy. They need to show their power, and they need to have an army and a navy so that they can exercise. Roosevelt and other people think that a country that's powerful needs to have a military, because that's one way that stimulates and creates like a strong culture, is that you need a strong military. And if you don't, that weakens your culture. And this is a cultural studies class. I'm sure some of you forgot somewhere along the line that we might be talking about literature, we might be talking about history or sociology or anthropology or many other things. But this is a cultural thing. They make the argument that powerful countries need to periodically go to war. And America, there's great evidence of that being the case in America. For the most of America's history, over 200 years, 90% of the time, they've been at war with somebody. It's shocking to actually look at the numbers, but it's true. Think about it. 1776, they had a 7-year war with the British. As soon as they were done with that in 1783, they had, some confrontations with various people, but then they didn't really have a big war until 1812. But then they have a series of wars with different native tribes, right? And then they have the Mexican War, and then they have the Civil War, and they have continued to have wars with the natives until the natives are defeated, and then there's no more frontier. And then after that, they go beyond their frontier and they fight the Spanish, and then they stop fighting the Spanish. And then all of a sudden, we're at World War I. So it was never called World War I at the time. We should call it the Great War. The main thing I want you to know, I want you to read what's in the textbook, and I want you to know, the thing about the Great War is that European civilization was at its height Its technology, its architecture, its philosophy, its artwork, everything. Europe was rich and it was imperial. It controlled half the world with its military and political power, and except there wasn't one superpower anymore. It wasn't Pax Britannica, which is, remember, that's the 99 years, I'll call it 100 years, but 99 years between Waterloo and 1914. It's because Germany, and to a certain extent, Germany, and especially Germany, but the United States, but also even Japan, France, and Italy, and Russia, they're all industrializing and they're catching up. And the British are not, they're still a superpower, but they're not the only superpower. Now you've got Russia, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the French, and possibly the Americans, if you consider them a superpower at this point, maybe not. But they have the potential, and the Japanese, which aren't a superpower either, but they have the potential. So you've got these 5 big powers, and the balance is very delicate, and they're all sort of developing military technology. And it just an important prince in the Austro-Hungarian Empire is assassinated in Serbia, and that's all it takes. They're just looking, everybody's nervous, everybody's in a hair trigger, and then one country declares war on another, and it creates a chain reaction, which starts World War I. Everybody thought World War I would be quick. They thought it would be, everybody would be home by Christmas, and it would be a destructive war, but one that was so destructive that it would, the destruction would run itself out, sort of, quickly. So unlike the 4 years of the American Civil War, or the series of Napoleonic wars, which add up to maybe the French Revolutionary Wars, and that add up to almost 20 years of fighting, which over 20 years is a terrible number of killing and death and casualties. Even worse, they take all those Napoleon deaths and they condense them into 4 years in the Civil War. And then the World War I, they just think you can't possibly kill more people than what you're doing, but you can. You can get gigantic guns. You can put them in, you can build trenches, and you can put these things in the ground, and you can shoot these bullets so far that into the sky that you can't see them, and then they can come down into somebody's camp, explode and shatter, send people's body parts everywhere. It's totally traumatic. It's nothing like riding horses with a bright uniform like George Washington, pointing your sword and getting lucky and not having 5 bullets hit you in the stomach. People are using machine guns. There's barbed wire in trenches. The weather's horrible. There's no airplanes yet. The soldiers are exposed. They keep trying to rush them, and they just rush into defensive positions, and people just kill each other. Germans and British and French people on both sides sometimes just stop shooting their machine guns and let people crawl back to their lines because they've just killed so many people and they just get sick of it. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And that's why it was called the Great War, because they thought that would be the last one, but there wasn't. I can't explain all the important things that go into that, but basically what happens is America's not in it. The Europeans enter the war, fight each other. You're going to have to do some reading from the textbook on this, about what happens here. But basically, the United States doesn't participate until the end of the war because Germany starts attacking their shipping, and they declare war and they join the war on the Allies' side. Whether or not they could have defeated Germany without America is something we'll never know. Japan never really entered the war, but they kind of took some territory away from Germany and some European colonies in the east while they were unable to respond. And so America comes in at the end, and they fight and they take lots of casualties. They fight very well. Many of them die, but they're only in the war for basically less than the last year. They're only there from 1917 to 1918. And Germany gives up, and America becomes the heroes, even though they weren't there for most of the war. But they put the pressure on the Germans, even though the Germans have already defeated Russia. It's too much for them on the Western Front to fight France, the British Empire, including Canada. That's the first, I say that because that's the first war that Canada has its own armed forces. The Dominion of Canada has its own corps and its own general. So World War I is important to Canadians because that's the birthplace of our army. But we're still under British command. So it's the British and the French and the Americans that force the Germans to surrender. But they still have 7-8 million people available to fight when they surrender. So when they surrender and the terms are very harsh, they're very bitter, and this creates the situation for Adolf Hitler to make all these promises that he's going to, fix all the unfair terms of the Versailles Treaty that was signed at the end of World War I. That sets up the whole, appeasement period and the sort of reaction of the German people and the support of Hitler, which totally gets out of control and turns into a war that's even worse. What's important about the Great War as opposed to the World War II? We're not going to talk about World War II too much. We don't have time. I'd like to teach a course about that, but the Great War, everything on the World War II, there's lots of things that are remarkably different. For example, there's an atomic bomb at the end of World War II, and that's a dramatic difference in firepower. But in general, you look at World War I, beginning, they're using horses and blue and white uniforms and yellow sparkles on them. At the end, they're wearing metal helmets and fatigues that are camouflage, green and gray and dark colors, right? They invent the machine gun, which the machine gun can kill dozens of people better than a rifle, right? So you've got, all of a sudden, instead of people firing a rifle every 10 seconds, every 5 seconds, or 10 seconds a minute, you're shooting like 50 bullets a minute, and a single group of people can hold back 100 other soldiers. And by the end of the war, they invent the tank. At the beginning of the war, we're talking about human beings and human culture mostly here, but to be honest, we depended on horses and dogs and domestic animals to survive for thousands and thousands of years. And often we don't recognize the contributions of those animals to our activities as human beings. There were millions of horses being used in war. Napoleon just had to use millions of them. And at the beginning of World War I, there was millions of horses, and millions of them got killed. Bombs dropped on them, their legs broke, they got sick, they couldn't carry their wagon, they got stuck in the mud. If you see pictures of World War I, they start to have motor vehicles, but there's not enough of them. So there's just thousands and thousands of vehicles and horses laying on the side of the road, and there's not enough people around to take care of them if they're still alive, or dispose of them or clear them away. It looks like something, if you look at black and white pictures of the battles, it looks like something that people are fighting on the moon, not in Verdun, not in Passchendaele in Belgium, but it's just gray and there's water everywhere and there's chemicals. They use gas, right? They use mustard gas. My great uncle was gassed and it damaged his lungs, and it's chlorine gas, and he could never, his lungs were never the same after that. The first time there was a gas attack, nobody knew anybody was going to do it. The wind blew the wrong way sometimes and blew it right into your face, but nobody even had gas masks the first time they did it because it had never been done before. They started using airplanes for scouting. All these things, it's revolutionary. What the countries and civilization look like at the beginning and what they look like at the end are completely different. Society will never be the same. It sets the groundwork for all the technology. They've come up with radio, they come up with automobiles, they start using airplanes, and all these things will get refined, and then we'll end up with computers and internet and stuff, and go way beyond radio, and we'll have Wi-Fi and stuff like that. But this World War I is like all countries invest everything they have, all their resources, like just put everything they have into the war effort, and it accelerates technology and the death and the industrial production and the economies. Everything goes right to the limit until countries are shattered, right? Germany's never the same. Austro-Hungarian Empire disappears forever. The Russian Empire is never the same, even though they do make a comeback as the Soviet Union. But most of the European countries, the French Empire, they try to recover in the interwar period, but the imperial age is effectively rapidly going to decline into World War II. One of the reasons that they don't fight Hitler harder at the beginning of World War II is because they're just trying to keep their empires, but they don't have they have a very tenuous hold on their colonies and their territories. So fighting a war with Hitler is probably going to be enough to break the empire for good, and it does. Okay, so that's all very important. America is spared this. This is what I want you to know. We're 20 minutes through the video, but America and Japan are the real winners. There's only two winners in World War I. Not Korea, excuse me. They're a loser as well. The USA and Japan, because Japan doesn't get attacked. Japan doesn't really do even as much fighting as the US. There's no real resistance in the East, and there's no real fighting in that theater, just a little bit. And so they can just take advantage and grab a few territories and just sit back and keep working on their project to modernize and industrialize and militarize without any interference. Europe is completely destroyed, from all the way from Brest-Litovsk, from halfway to Moscow, all the way to France. England gets spared until World War II. They get bombed, but in this case, they don't suffer too much at home, but they lose 1 million people, which is a huge number of young men and women to have sacrificed. So the USA comes out far ahead in this, which means that they financed the war. It's incredibly expensive. The flow of finance and economic business is in London in 1914, and by the 1920s, it's in New York. That's because the war was so expensive that basically the USA bankrolled it, and they didn't want. That's another reason, it kind of is a cynical reason, but that's another reason they didn't want to fight in the war. Not just because George Washington said, don't get mixed up in all these European alliances that'll get you in a war with somebody sooner or later. It's also about, they need stuff, they need equipment. The Germans need stuff. They don't care who they're selling to at the beginning. They need guns, they need ammunition, they need bombs, they need metal, they need equipment, they need clothing, they need shoes, they need food. And the United States, their economy wasn't in great condition, and they just experience an economic boom because of the high demand for military materiel in World War I. So it turns out that from 1900, at the beginning of the century, the USA is kind of, they had a bad depression in the 1890s, and they're just recovering from it, but just going through the early century when they start getting their jobs back, and then they end up joining World War I, breaking their isolationist policy and becoming internationalist. Things are looking pretty good again. America's looking like it's catching up, and that it's developing, and that it's one of the most attractive places to live, and it wasn't damaged. People have jobs, people have opportunities, population is growing. It's the roaring 20s, right? It's the roaring 20s. Everybody's dancing, everybody has money, everything's going fast, everything's going great. This is the first period. So we're going to divide this into 3 periods. Okay? This is the American century. Get Japan out of there. The American century. And this is the 20th century, of course, not this century. But the funny thing is, Tim Luce, I think his name's Tim. Tim Luce, he's the founder of Time Magazine. Everybody knows Time Magazine, even though people don't buy magazines. It was just the most iconic magazine, along with, Vogue and Cosmopolitan and a few other, Forbes maybe. But everybody used to buy this magazine, and there's a Time Magazine Person of the Year and all this kind of stuff. So he founded that magazine, and it's still very popular and still has some respect. He said in 1941 that this was the American century and that America needed to enter the war, World War II this is, and America needed to spread its values, and it was wealthy and powerful, and it was time for America to flex its international muscle. This is the American century. I'm not saying, only in retrospect can this quote have been made so great. Like, there's no way he's a prophet. So he said that in February of 1941. And at the end of that year, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and forced the United States into the war, which is what some American politicians wanted. FDR wanted that. Certainly Luce did. There was a bunch of people that they wanted to fight in the war, but they didn't really have a reason other than to help the United Kingdom, which was the British Empire was the only person left fighting, right? After 1940. But in 1941, Hitler decided he was going to attack Russia, and Japan decided they were going to attack America, which was a huge mistake. But that was December 7th, 1941. That's the famous speech FDR says, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. That was the start of his speech. I love that speech. And then he does this speech, and at the end of the speech, America declares war on Japan. And all of you should listen to that speech, because that was the beginning of your freedom. No joke. So there's the early optimism, but then they run smack into the end of the 20s. There's going to be two interruptions, two crises in this century. The first crisis is the Depression. The Great Depression is going to ruin the banks, ruin agriculture, ruin people's jobs. The stock market's going to drop in New York in 1929. Hoover's going to lose the presidency over it, but FDR is going to turn out to be a really good president anyway. But for about 10 years, from 1929 to 1939, America's economy is going to shrink, 30% unemployment, there's going to be poverty, there's going to be, all kinds of attempts, political solutions. Nothing's really going to overcome it until they enter World War II. And when they enter World War II, they have to get along, which is very rare, but sometimes happens in a crisis, right? This is not a crisis. This is a crisis. And the crisis causes the politicians in the American government, the ones that hate each other and never agree on anything, the Republicans and the Democrats, to we got to do something, or California is going to get attacked. We need to spend money, and we need to start building stuff, and we need to organize the military. And so they just follow FDR. The Republicans go along with it, and all of a sudden, democracy, which is usually a very slow form of government in making decisions, all of a sudden they go into crisis mode, emergency mode, and the first 100 days, this is before World War II, but during the Depression, the first 100 days, they work together and they come up with a whole bunch of plans to try and help the economy recover. It doesn't work well, but by the time World War II comes around, the liberal consensus, the government is working well together, and America quickly ups its industrial output and gets on a war footing, and they start pushing across the Pacific, in 1942, and they push all the way there into 1945 without stopping. They really don't slow down very much. 3 years of relentless pressure and immense amounts of economic and military power being applied. The liberal consensus lasts until basically World War II is over and the crisis is over. And then everybody dislikes each other again, especially though the people like the black people or the Japanese who lived in America but were not Japanese citizens but ended up in concentration camps or I don't like the word concentration camp. I'm not sure. They're basically taken away from their homes and placed in like an enclosed area. It is a sort of imprisonment. They're not allowed to leave, so they are prisoners. They're not doing experiments on them like what the Nazis are doing, but they remove them from their homes, they take their money and their jobs, and they put them in an internment camp where they're not allowed to leave because they're concerned they'll be spies. Nonetheless, some Japanese people fight in Germany on the American side. A lot of African Americans, Hispanic Americans are fighting for the American army, but they're fighting in their own units. They're segregated. The white Americans fight in their groups, and there's a Japanese unit that's all Japanese with a white officer, and then there's very few black officers, and then they all are commanded in their own units. So after World War II, there's the Korean War, and Truman decides to desegregate. So the Korean War is the first war in which white and black people and Hispanic people and Asians in the American army all fight together, and that was in Korea. So fun fact for you to know there. But that means segregation in the army continued in 1945. Remember, there was the Emancipation Proclamation, and they freed the slaves, but you go fight for your country, you die for your country, and you come back, and then you have to go to a separate bathroom, you have to sit at the back of the bus, you go to a different school, you don't have the same access to bank loans, you can't buy a house, people don't want to give you a job. Well, it's nice that I'm not a slave, but I'm living at the bottom of society, and I gave my life for my country. I fought just as hard as anybody else, and then I come back and I'm a second-class citizen. Think about it. Fought against the Japanese imperials who were obviously trying to subjugate a whole bunch of people. Hitler, again, obviously a fascist maniac, and he was trying to oppress all people. He was oppressing the Germans too, but he was trying to kill people and oppress people. The black people in America went, some of them on principle, because they believed in democracy and they believed in America as a superior model. And then you go and you fight against the Germans, and you see that their system is messed up, and you come back home and you're like, wait a second, our system's messed up too. We don't, it's not as bad as other countries, but this is not even close to equality. This is very far from it. In fact, this is the farthest thing from equality except slavery. So we got to do something about this. That's the civil rights movement. Malcolm X, you have to read a little bit about, I don't put Malcolm X in there, but Martin Luther King Jr. is my favorite because he's a Baptist minister and I like the way he speaks. The I Have a Dream speech is a very famous one. He ends up being assassinated. The 60s are pretty wild. Vietnam happens. There's a lot of protests. There's a lot of resistance about many things. But the African-American political effort does push the United States government to pass through a civil rights law, which finally protects the right of people to vote. And then on the back of that, other marginalized groups and discriminative practices, because women already have the vote, but of course there's other issues as well, like equal pay at work, or whether you can discriminate when you're hiring somebody, whether you can discriminate between men and women. And then there's after that, like these hippie sort of cultural issues, peace and anti-establishment and freedom of sexuality, and combating racism and promoting equality and love. All these things, they're ideas, and there was a massive popular movement that pushed the government to respond to some of them, but some of them have subsequently been pushed back. There's often conservative reactions to these things, which is why the last period of the 20th century is called the neoconservative era, because that is the reaction to basically from the Depression all the way to the civil rights. The presidency is FDR, Truman, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Truman's in there for 12 years, right? Sorry, not Truman. FDR is in there for 12 years. Truman's in there for 2 terms. Kennedy's in there for a term. Lyndon Johnson's in there for a term. So the Republicans feel like a lot of things have happened that have pushed America too far, and so they're the new conservatives. They start to try and shrink the budget and reduce healthcare and reduce spending, but they still like to spend money on military expenditure. So often these people they've been referred to as, we refer to them as hawks, because they're interested in military policy, but sometimes we call them chicken hawks, because a chicken hawk is one that looks like a hawk, but not really, because some of these politicians don't actually have military experience. They never served, so they're pushing for a military policy, but they don't know what it's like to serve as a soldier or work in the military. So they're just spending money without any real understanding of what it takes. So that is the American century. America's future actually is after this. We're living in the future now. Maybe this wasn't the best title. I should have called it the American century, but that's what I usually call it. And I like to think forward. Think about all the things you learned about this, all these cycles, and there's crises, and then there's cycles, and there's money problems, and there's war. Is that going to continue, or can we prevent that? That's more of a history question, but this is what the American culture is like. American culture is flexible. It's constantly in flux. Remember those 5 ideals, right? The exam is ready. I've got it in my hand. The thing that I have to talk to you tomorrow about is I'm going to talk to you really briefly about the structure of the government, and I'm going to talk to you about Native people briefly, and then we're going to talk about Hollywood, American cinema as a representative part of culture, mention a few more presidents, and then take up questions and overview before we finish the exam. But make sure you know all this stuff, and that you read over the stuff in the textbook. It's there too. These stages and everything, make sure you're familiar with them before the exam, because they'll be there, guaranteed. Okay, thank you for listening. That's the last one. Thank you, everybody, for your attention and your time on YouTube. And I hope you enjoyed and were informed by some of the things that I taught you this semester. Any questions or any problems, come and see me on Friday in our last in-person lecture. Have a good holiday, and see you next week.